You're not going to see the results that you want to see with God if you keep expecting God to be the one doing all the moving. Hello and welcome everybody to the 12th episode of Ascension to Depth. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune into this show. I hope that it finds you well, and I hope that over the last couple months you've had a blessing from this show. You've had some sort of benefit from this show. I hope that at least one of the episodes has touched you. I hope that at least one of the episodes has spoken to you and gotten you to think about things maybe in a different way or just a more elevated way. And hopefully that in turn made you get deeper into a relationship with God. And so if you have been benefited by the show, if you have been blessed by the show, I do have a request from you. Subscribe and share the show with somebody else. If you don't know, my Instagram got hacked, so I no longer have a personal Instagram. And so I'm no longer able to reach the 200-ish people that I could reach with my Instagram, but I got you guys. And so if you could share the episode with somebody, share the channel with somebody, get them to subscribe, get them to elevate their way of thinking like maybe you have. And so if you haven't already, subscribe. I'm sorry to ask, but if you haven't already, subscribe. And without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Last week, we talked about the idea of neutrality. We talked about how we cannot be neutral in our walk with God. To make your calling and election sure means to throw away the idea of neutrality. It means that you have to be all in on this, to be sure about this. And so if you missed that, please go back and give it a listen. I hope that it's an encouragement. It helps you stand firm in what you believe. And this week we're going to take on a bit of a lighter tone. All right. Last week it was very like do or die. And so this week we're going to take on a bit of a lighter tone. I do want to talk about coming out of things like complacency, inaction, indecisiveness, if you will, or even to some degree, maybe a little bit of trauma, things that have bothered you for a long time, things that have scarred you. And I want to take a look at a couple stories in the Bible because I want to talk about getting up. I want to talk about rising above those things. And the first story I want to look at is in Exodus chapter 14, verse 10 through 15. And this is when Pharaoh is chasing down the Israelites when they were escaping from captivity. And so verse 10 in Exodus 14 says, "And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. And they said unto Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he shall show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace." And that sounds great, but then in verse 15, the Lord said unto Moses, "Wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel, that they go forward." And I love God's response to this situation. Here are the Israelites being hunted, and they are caught between their past catching up to them and an uncertain and daunting future. And their first instinct isn't fight or flight. They didn't try to run away. They didn't try to take up arms. Their first instinct was to place blame and complain. And Moses is saying, don't worry, God will do something. Like a lot of times we say that, like hold peace, stay calm, just be still. And to a degree, that happens. There are times where we need to be still. There are times where we need to slow down and be calm. I'm not denying that. But God interrupts him here. And he says, why are you crying to me for? Why are you crying for? Get up and go forward. Like, hey, it's probably obvious if someone's trying to kill you, don't stay where you are. Don't just sit there. And I also want to point out that they had just seen the plagues that God had set on Egypt. And so it's not like they don't know what God is capable of. They've seen God's power. And yet when they're being chased by their past, they decided their past is more powerful than the God of their future. And then they complained to Moses, like, why would you bring us out here? We should have just stayed. We should have just stayed in Egypt where we could just die over there. What, did you want us to just die in the wilderness? We should just have stayed over there. And there's this tendency among people who are scarred, among people who are scared as well, that when things get dire, when things get serious, or when things tend to get more and more pressurized, especially when you're getting delivered from something, when the devil does his one last attack, when he does that one last thing to try and keep you where you are, a lot of times people tend to cling to the bondage they know than trust the unknown potential freedom. Because you know how much this current stage hurts. You know how much this old bondage hurts. You know exactly what to expect. And you know how to cope with the pain that you've experienced. And you've already experienced that, but you don't know the unknown cost of freedom. You don't know the sea that separates you from your freedom. You don't know what you're going to have to cross. You don't know what's going to happen. And you start to lose hope because you can't even see the promise past the sea you have to cross. And the danger in that is that we start to invalidate the promise. We start to invalidate the promise we've received because we don't trust the way forward. And we start gravitating toward the bondage that we know instead of the freedom we haven't seen yet. And all the while, God is up there saying, well, why are you crying for it? Get up and move forward. Don't you see what's happening? Don't you see what's going on behind you? Don't you see that this is a trap from the enemy? Don't you see that the enemy's trying one last time to keep you in his clutches? Get up. Why are you looking back? Get up and go forward. And before we go on, I do want to look at another story in the Bible because I love this story in the Bible and it's not talked about enough. I mean, we've all heard the story, but it's probably like maybe mid-ranking in the sense of like how often people talk about it. But I love this story in 2 Kings chapter 7. And we're going to go to verse 3 through 6. The Bible says, and there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate. And they said one to another, why sit we here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit still here, we die also. Now therefore, come, let us fall unto the host of the Syrians, and if they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. And they rose up in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the king of the Hittites and the king of the Egyptians to come upon us. Amazing. An amazing miracle that these men, these leprous men, just got up and started walking. And then the enemy in the camp is like, oh my goodness, what the heck is going on out there? There's a whole army coming against us. There's multiple armies coming against us. But before we get into that, let's just recognize the simple wisdom. Let's just recognize the first simple wisdom that they said. If you stay where you are, you die. If you go to where there's no food, you die. But if you go forward, you might live. You might just make it. I'll put it this way. If you don't grow, you're going to die. If you're not growing, you're going to die. Stagnation is not the same as living. Being constant is not the same as being consistent. And so if you're not moving forward constantly, if you just stay where you are, plateauing is not the same as living. Stagnation is not the same as living. I'll say it again. And even right now, if you want to look at it in a natural way, you're growing. Somehow, some way, your cells are dividing and they're replicating. And if they stopped right now, if your cells stopped moving right now, you would eventually develop tumors and die, assuming that the rest of the systems in your body work after all your cells stopped moving. But the same can be said in the spiritual, except spiritual growth is a little bit more like muscle growth because it's not just happening. It requires intention. But the same thing can happen. If you just don't move spiritually, you can just develop atrophy, if you will, like muscle atrophy. That's a better analogy. If you don't move, if you don't use your spiritual life, if you don't walk in that spiritual way, you can develop a spiritual atrophy. When you develop atrophy, the muscles that you didn't use become harder to use. Doing things like picking up a water bottle become so much more difficult to do. And they develop this numbness to where you might not even feel the muscles that you have. Forgive me, any nurses that are listening to this. Sorry if I got that way wrong. But if you don't do anything, you become weaker. Strain is what produces strength. Struggle is what produces strength. Resistance is what produces strength, because you have to constantly make yourself stronger in order to get whatever it is that's holding you down off of you. And so if you don't grow spiritually, you develop that kind of spiritual atrophy. And so what I'm saying is that you're not going to see the results that you want to see with God if you keep expecting God to be the one doing all the moving. And sometimes God will look right back at you, and after you've complained, after you've fretted, after you panicked, and after you were scared, and after you just told God why everything is wrong and why he was wrong to put you here and why he was wrong to do this to you and why you were wrong to do that and the other, and while you regret this and while you regret that, God is looking down at you and he's just going, get up and move. Get up and go forward. And let's just jump back to the lepers for a moment, actually. And let me encourage you in this, because learn to just move in the direction God's telling you to move in. That's what I'm trying to get at here. I know that I had like a bit of a long way to get here, but learn to just move in the direction that God's telling you to move in. Learn to just make the best of what you have and offer it to God so that he can do what he wants to do with it. Because you don't know what God can do with your obedience. You don't know what God can do when you just simply say, okay, this is what I've been dealt. I'm giving this over to you, and you do what you want to do with it. And then God does whatever he needs to do. And a lot of times, if not all the time, actually, it's all the time. Every time God gets his hands on something, it's better than what you could have done with it. And your obedience is what unlocks the door to those blessings. We all have places that God is calling us to. We all have different things that God is trying to get us into. And we all have reasons as to why we can't do it. We all have reasons as to why we don't want to do what God wants us to do. We all have reasons as to why we're not qualified. But you have to ask yourself, am I okay being a slave to circumstance? Am I okay with the fact that I'm letting my life control me and I'm not controlling my life? So you can either be like the Israelites who took what's happening to them and complain and be scared, or you can be like the lepers who look at their situation and they say, enough is enough. We're moving. We're going forward. Enough is enough. I'm not going to live in this state of stagnation. I'm not going to be scared of my past. I'm not going to just sit here and do nothing. I'm going to get up and I'm going to go forward. So what stops us? Because we can either be one or the other. What stops us? And what I found, for some people, it's fear. Others, it's laziness. For some people, it's trauma. And for some, it's the fact that they just don't like change. But at the end of the day, I think, and there's multiple ways to think about this. I don't think that my way is the only way to think about this. But to me, it boils down to value. I've known a lot of people with tremendous traumas in their life that they don't really ever recover from completely. And I know some people who get way beyond it, who conquer their trauma. And I know people who just look at their past and tell you why they can't move into their future. But then I look at people who show you what they have going on now and how it's in spite of their past. People who base their present circumstances on their past are bound by their past, in my opinion. Because you're either where you are because you moved beyond your past, or you're where you're at because your past is binding you to that spot. And so I wanted to say that to say this, because there are even ministries today that are started by people who experienced the bondage that they're helping deliver people out of. Which I do want to also add that is what God does all the time. He turns the chains that bound you into the instruments, the keys that loosen the chains on someone else. So don't ever look at your chains. Don't ever look at the struggle that you've been through. Don't look at the trauma that you've been through as a curse from God, because God could be preparing you to help get the chains off of somebody else. And so learn to embrace what happened to you and make that make you better. And back to my point, I've talked to people who have come out of terrible situations. The majority of them always said something along the lines of this when I've asked them why they were able to do it, how they were able to do it. Even when I look at myself, I've been through quite a few things in my life, and I look at it, and this is the general idea. I just wanted to move forward more than I wanted to forget. I remember somebody told that to me, and it really struck a chord in me. I just wanted to move forward more than I wanted to forget. And that's often something we do. A lot of times we try to forget the bad things that have happened to us. We try to distance ourselves from the things by avoidance, or instead of confrontation at least. We try to avoid the things that used to hold us down, the chains that we feel are over us. We try to avoid the trauma. We try to avoid the bad memories, the fears. We try to avoid them instead of confronting them. And there's a difference between conquering something and moving on, and avoiding something and moving away. Because when you conquer something, if you see it again, you're unfazed, and then you just conquer it again. When you avoid something, more often than not, you run away. But when you run away, you're allowing it to still hold that same power over you. And so the reason I bring that up is because, to me, it's a question of value. Because you have to want where you're going more than where you're at or where you were. The Israelites in the story showed really quick how much their freedom meant to them. And they do it again as well, not even just in that story. They also do it again later when they complain about the manna that God provided. So to them, freedom was less valuable than comfort. And even if you can call it comfort, their lives in Egypt were lives of bondage. But I suppose you can grow comfortable in chains. They were more attracted to the fruits and meats of Egypt than they were willing to forget, or at least rationalize, the whips and the labor they had to go through. And we need to be very careful that we don't fall in love with the comfort of chains, because there is a comfort in knowing the pain you're going to experience. If you can embrace yourself, it's a little bit more comforting than not knowing what kind of pain is coming your way. But freedom comes at the cost of pain sometimes. And so, of course, God looks at them. And of course, God looks at us and just says, get up. Because you need to make it a priority for yourself. You need to decide that you have enough faith to at least face the sea and then watch God split it. You need to decide that you're not going to die where you are. And how often do we let life happen to us and we wonder why we don't have any control over it? How often do we pick comfortable over uncomfortable and then wonder why things become difficult? How long are we going to look at God and expect Him to give us a desire to be free from our past or present circumstances? So I'm going to say it here and now. Get up. Stop waiting for circumstances to bend to your favor. Don't wait for a more convenient time. Don't wait for life to get easier. Get up now. Get up today and move forward. Because you don't know the sounds the enemy hears when you get up and just start walking with God. You don't know the terror that strikes the enemy when you just decide, I'm just going to get up. If we go over there and we die, we die. If I get up and chase my dream and I fail, I fail. If I chase my ministry, if I fail, I fail. But I'm going to get up and start walking with God. And you don't know the terror that rings in the enemy's ears when you decide that. When you decide that you're just going to go for it. You don't know how wide the sea is going to split. You don't know how much blessing is on the other side, how much promise is on the other side. But you need to get up and stop waiting for God to come to you and start chasing him down yourself. Start going after God yourself, because as you draw nigh to him, he'll draw nigh to you. But if you reject him, if you just push him away, he may not push you away, but he won't get any closer. He won't get any closer to you. But as soon as you start running after God, he starts running after you. Be encouraged today to conquer your life. With the help of God, there is nothing that can stand in your way. There's nothing that can stop you from the love of God. There's nothing that can stop you when God is on your side. The whole world can be against you, but if you got God, you're in the majority. And stop hiding from what God wants you to do. I don't know what it is that he wants you to do. I don't know what your calling is. I don't know what it is that he wants from you. Maybe it's a ministry, maybe it's a career, or maybe it's just to be happy where you are because you've spent so much time complaining about how much you wish it could be better. Maybe sometimes God is just saying, get up and look around. Maybe get up and look around and just thank him for the blessings you got, for the places that you are. So to all of you, I say, get up, get up, get up, and move forward. And with that being said, I hope that this episode has been a blessing to you. Again, please subscribe to the show. Please share it. Please get it to people. I hope that if this has benefited you, it hopefully benefits somebody that you know. And so with all that being said, get up and move forward. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you and Godspeed.